here we are again with Dr. Allison. Professor Allison, who do you believe wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and when and where? So, can you give us something more about this topic?
Okay, so so the tradition, of course, is that it was written by Matthew, a disciple of Jesus. I think that's unlikely. I can't disprove that, but I think this book was written probably 80 to 90, somewhere in there. So it's after the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it was written originally in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic. And I think that it used sources. For example, I think it knows the Gospel of Mark really well. And I think it knows another source that Luke also knew and used, a collection of sayings of Jesus. And so I don't think that this is an eyewitness text. I think it's a text that's using sources. And there is no indication anywhere in it that the author is an eyewitness. When I read through it, I don't read a story and say, oh, that sounds like somebody was there. I don't see that at all. And there's no claim here. So in the Gospel of John, you have some sentences about the beloved disciple, and you have an association of the book with him. In the Gospel of Luke, in the first 4 verses, you have the author saying, well, I've talked to some eyewitnesses, right? But you don't have anything like this with Matthew. Now, my own guess, it's just a guess, I can't do anything more with this, is that the early tradition about Matthew writing this might go back to the fact that one of the early sources in Matthew was associated with the Apostle Matthew. So the way to think about this is through an analogy. So if you read any introduction to the New Testament today, Old Testament today, and you read the chapter on Isaiah, you will find the standard line, which is that chapters 1 through 39 contain original oracles from Isaiah the prophet mixed in with some other things. But then chapters 40 through 55 are from what they call second Isaiah. And then the last part of the book is from what's called third Isaiah. Now, my point here is to say that there are oracles in the first part of the book that come from Isaiah, but the book contains much else besides. Nonetheless, it's still known as the book of Isaiah. So when people took this source and then they added to it and then they added more, it still was associated with Isaiah's name. So I think you might do something similar for the Gospel of Matthew. That is, if one of its sources may be the same source that Matthew is using, maybe if that has Matthew's name attached to it, and maybe it had some genuine association with him, when that is then taken up to a larger source, you keep the name Matthew. So I think that's a way of explaining the attribution. But again, I don't see any claim to authorship in the book. I don't see any association with an eyewitness inside the book. And it looks to me like the author is highly dependent on sources. And that doesn't prove anything, but I think it more likely that somebody who was an eyewitness to everything would take a more independent path. I also think the book reflects the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And this is too complicated to get into here, but I think there are really interesting connections between Matthew's gospel and really early or proto-early rabbinic Judaism. That is, there are traditions within the rabbis associated in particularly with a rabbi known as Yohanan ben Zakkai. I think there are connections between traditions about him and Matthew, and he's active right before and after 70. So I would put Matthew there. I also think, this is a change of mind, but I think the Gospel of John knows Matthew, and if John is written in the 90s or 100 or somewhere around in there, that puts Matthew before that. So I'm fairly confident with that date. There are some still who will argue that Matthew wrote the whole thing or that it comes from before 70, but I haven't been persuaded by their arguments.
Okay, and where was it written? Was it Antioch or yeah?
So Antioch's the most popular guess, maybe somewhere in Syria. Uh, the one thing that's really interesting to me regarding this question, we don't have any real early data on it, is that when people talk about the Gospel of Matthew later on, they always associate it with the East, not the West. In other words, they never associate it with Rome or Italy or Greece. They always think of uh, the East rather than the West. And I think that's probably a real memory there. Uh, Scholars want to pin down Antioch. Maybe they're right to do so. I guess I argued for that at one point, but I don't think a lot hinges upon it. I just think that it's from the eastern part of the Mediterranean, not the western part.
Okay, we have tradition in church history that Matthew was written in Hebrew from Papias and others. So maybe some scholars say that Hebrew Matthew was a Q source actually. So what do you think about all this?
So I actually did some work once on uh, the so-called Q text, which is the hypothetical sane source behind Matthew and Luke. So I reconstructed the text, compared it to other reconstructions, and then I took the Greek reconstruction and ran it through some tables that contain statistics. This gets very complicated. Statistics regarding what you find in Greek translations of Hebrew sources. That is, for example, if you look at all the sources in Greek that we know translate Hebrew texts, like the text in the Septuagint, Genesis in Greek translates Genesis in Hebrew, right? If you take all these texts together, you can make some generalizations. For example, the little word kai, which means and, occurs at the beginning of sentences more often in sources translated from Semitic languages than in classical Greek. Okay. So I ran a bunch of these factors and I found parts of so-called Q that really did look like they could qualify as translation Greek. So I think that's possible. And again, it could account for what you have in Papias, that is, um, some early source was written in another language, then it's translated into Hebrew. Other things are added, but you still keep the name of Matthew associated with it all along the way.
Thank you so much. And you said in one interview that Luke does not use Matthew as a source.
No, no,
So how do
no.
you, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very popular uh, thing to think today, but it's just I'm completely unconvinced by it. So the there are really smart, good scholars, well informed about this issue, who think that Luke is using Matthew, but I can't understand it. I think, for example, that if you go through the Sermon on the Mount, that it looks like something like Luke 6 was the source. It's not the other way around. That is, Luke isn't taking the magnificent Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and editing it down and scattering the material and creating a little discourse in Luke 6. It's the other way around. Luke is close to his Q source, and Matthew is expanding it. Um, I think that there are many places where you put Matthew and Luke side by side, the so-called Sayings tradition, and Luke has to be more primitive than Matthew. So this gets into very detailed linguistic arguments. And again, really smart people disagree with me and think I'm all wrong here. But I think they're wrong. And Luke appears to me in many places to be more primitive and original than Matthew is. I think that they probably appear at about the same time and may be genuinely independent of each other.
All right, thank you. And how would you rate the accuracy of Matthew's gospel compared to other gospels? How would you evaluate Gospel of Matthew?
I don't know how I would. I Gosh, that's a difficult question. I don't know how to answer it. I would say that I'm old-fashioned with regard to the synoptics and John. That is, I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are closer to the historical Jesus than is John. John has no exorcisms. John has little about the kingdom of God. John does not have a near expectation, of the last things. John's Christology is more explicit and public. In the Synoptics, you have a messianic secret. Jesus doesn't want people talking about him and so on. I think in all those particulars, the Synoptics are original. Now, if you want to compare the three synoptics, I'm not sure how to do that because I would say Matthew is closer to Jesus in some ways, and Mark is closer than Matthew and others. So just one example. I think that Mark has probably been influenced by Paul, or at least the Pauline circle. And I think Mark presents Jesus as having dispensed with the law of Moses. Matthew does not. In Matthew, Jesus comes not to abolish the law and the prophets. He comes not to abolish, but to fulfill them. Even though Matthew is using Mark, I think Matthew's Jesus, who is still observing Torah, is more plausible historically than Mark, who is on his way to being a bit like Paul. So there's a way in which Matthew, I think, is closer to Jesus, even though he's the later document. But
Right.
on the whole, I don't know how to generalize on the whole. I just don't know how to do that. I'd have to go, piece by piece, because it's not Mark is always closer to Jesus than Matthew or vice versa. It's just not true. Things vary from topic to topic.